Oral questions, questions orales. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we saw a very sad spectacle from the Prime Minister yesterday. The Liberals like to target local businesses, middle-class families, and even sick people. But when the Liberal bagman or the Minister of Finance try to hide their assets or avoid paying taxes, you hear nothing from the Prime Minister. How long has the Prime Minister known that his chief fundraiser is hiding money in tax havens? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to fighting against tax avoidance and evasion. In our last two budgets, we invested nearly $1 billion, Mr. Speaker. And we did so to fight tax frauds, and our plan is bearing fruit, Mr. Speaker. 627 cases transferred to criminal investigations, 268 search warrants, 78 convictions. The agency is looking into links with Canadian entities and will take the necessary measures. And we will continue to work to have a fair system for all Canadians.
Well, Mr. Speaker, while accusing local small business owners of being tax cheats, this Prime Minister has gone out of his way to protect the interests of his rich, well-connected Liberal friends. The Paradise Papers exposed the Prime Minister's close friend and chief political fundraiser as having sheltered millions of dollars offshore. Now, the Bronfmans are also known for being very effective at lobbying against closing off offshore tax loopholes. So when did the Prime Minister learn that his friend and chief fundraiser had these offshore holdings and that his lawyers had lobbied so hard to protect these tax havens?
Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is aware that this is an issue involving several billion dollars, and we've made historic investments of nearly $1 billion in the Canada Revenue Agency to deal with this problem. The agency is using the information that it's received, for example, from lists given by partner countries. And this is why the agency has more than 980 investigations undergoing and 42 criminal investigations that have to do with structures abroad. And this is as of the 30th of December. We will continue to work in this vein.
Well, like the issues surrounding the finance minister, it's funny that things only start to happen when Liberals only get caught. While looking out for his friends and insiders, the Prime Minister put a target on the pocketbooks of hardworking Canadians. He accuses local business owners of being tax cheats even while he's raising their taxes, but he turns a blind eye to the loopholes that his friends enjoy using. It's almost as if there's one set of rules for the Prime Minister and his wealthy friends and another set of rules for everybody else. So why is it that every time this Prime Minister makes changes, it always benefits those in the jet set life and always makes life harder for those in the road trip life?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, I think it's strange that the Conservatives across the way are talking about the fact that we're not working to close tax loopholes, when in fact their government over the last 10 years did absolutely nothing, Mr. Speaker, when it came to tax evasion. Even a former National Revenue Minister, Mr. Jean-Pierre Blackburn, said so. He said so publicly, Mr. Speaker. So I think that my colleagues across the way are fairly hypocritical. They shouldn't be giving us lessons. Order. I would ask all members not to try to provoke people. I'm sure that's impossible, but at least I would ask them to try not to do that and to restrain themselves. The Honourable Member for Richmond-Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, while the Prime Minister claims to be asking the 1% to pay more, he's paying for his Christmas holidays with taxpayer money. He's passing the deficit on to the middle class, and he's targeting job creators all across the country. Now he's being even more hypocritical by ignoring the scandal of the Paradise Papers. Oh, or should I say the sponsorship scandal? It's hard to remember. I just want to make sure I understand. Is there a strategy to let Liberal friends put money in tax havens? And is this their way of making the 1% pay more? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, Our government is firmly committed to fight tax evasion and tax avoidance. And we want our tax system to be fair for all Canadians. I am proud of the leadership role that we have taken on the international stage. We've collaborated. There's been collaboration between different tax entities, including the sharing of information, and this is an essential tool to protecting the integrity of Canada's tax base. This is why the agency has more than 990 audits underway and 42 criminal investigations that have to do with actions abroad. The Honourable Member from Athabasca. Well, let's talk about the Minister's Department. Today we learned that the CRA is deliberately hiding the sums that were lost to tax evasion each year. And yet yesterday, the Minister of Revenue swore that everything was under control. Instead of saying anything and everything, can the Prime Minister for once give us a clear answer and tell us when he knew that his friend and a big Liberal fundraiser was hiding money in tax havens to avoid paying taxes? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, my colleague across the way is the one who's saying anything and everything. I can tell you that our government is firmly committed to fighting tax evasion and avoidance, and we are tackling this problem from many different angles, Mr. Speaker. In our first two budgets, we invested historic sums of nearly $1 billion. And last year, Mr. Speaker, the agency imposed $44 million in penalties on people who were preparing tax forms. We are carrying out the work that we promised Canadians we would do during the election campaign. The Honourable Member for Rimouski-Neja-Témiscouata Basque.
Yesterday, the Prime Minister told us that the CRA, the Canada Revenue Agency, would be looking into allegations of tax evasion, but he stopped short of confirming that this would be the case for Stephen Bronfman. This is the same CRA that is constantly under fire by tax experts for going hard against everyday Canadians, but for throwing back the big fish. This is the same CRA that forgave the clients who made millions from the KPMG scheme, and this is the same CRA who failed to act on the Panama Papers. When will the Minister stop defending the CRA and start standing up for Canadians?
The Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, I can tell my colleague across the way that I have more experience than he does when it comes to fishing. Our government is firmly committed to fighting tax avoidance and tax evasion. We had a historic budget last year which demonstrates that that is the case. We invested nearly $1 billion. Our plan is producing results. 627 cases transferred to criminal investigations, 268 search warrants, 78 convictions. We promised Canadians that we would do this work, and no one is above the law, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie.
About the law is the problem.
We now know that the chief Liberal fundraiser, Stephen Bronfman, put money in tax havens. His explanation? Well, he says that he always acted correctly and respected the laws that were in force. But that's exactly the problem. This is a funny excuse that I've heard before. I think it was the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance who were using it before. It's hard to remember which scandal it is. Will the Liberals finally take concrete steps against tax havens? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, tax havens are a priority in my mandate letter, and they are a priority for this government. That is why in the last two budgets, Mr. Speaker, we invested nearly $1 billion, which allowed us to hire new auditors, which allowed us to target 4 jurisdictions per year. We are working with our international partners, and the actions that we are taking and the plan that we have are bearing fruit. We will continue working for Canadians as we promised. The Honourable Member for Rosemont-la-Petite-Patrie. Mr. Speaker, if shoplifting was legal, then putting more police officers before the door wouldn't change anything. And that's exactly the case with tax havens. We're being robbed, but it's completely legal. Great. So the minister's response are just smoke and mirrors. They don't get to the underlying problem. We need to renegotiate our tax treaties with several countries. Will the Liberals commit to reviewing the agreements that we have with tax havens? And if they can't say yes, then it means they don't want to change anything. The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is working abroad to fight against tax evasion and tax avoidance. We are an important partner internationally with BEPS, Mr. Speaker, and the results that we've seen are working. When I talk about 627 cases transferred to criminal investigations, or I can mention 268 search warrants or 78 convictions. I don't know what the colleague across the way doesn't understand, Mr. Speaker. These are actions that are yielding results. Honourable Member for Rimouski-Nejet-Témiscouata-Lévesque.
Meaningless stats, she should understand one thing. We are lawmakers. Instead of hiding behind the bogus excuse of it's all legal anyways, we can roll up our sleeves and do something about it. We can change the laws. We can especially change laws that allow the wealthy and the well-connected to pay less taxes than middle-class Canadians. The question is, will this government do it? Or will they block these efforts like they have done for the past 2 years?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, as I've said, the government is firmly committed to fighting tax evasion and avoidance. What the Conservative Party this is something the Conservative Party didn't do for the last 10 years. And even a former Minister of National Revenue, Mr. Blackburn, said that that wasn't a priority. In the last 2 years, since our government came to power, we've invested $1 billion, Mr. Speaker, and we have real results. We're working internationally with partners. There are charges that have been laid. There are criminal investigations. There have been searches conducted, and we are working for Canadians and for tax fairness.
Honourable Member for Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister took great pains this summer explaining that hardworking fishers, farmers, and small business owners were really not paying their fair share and were in fact tax cheats. All the while, Mr. Speaker, we had the Liberal bagman and Prime Minister's close friends stashing $60 million away in the Cayman Islands tax scheme. So my question is very simple, Mr. Speaker. Why is this government so adamant to make life more difficult for honest tax-paying citizens and letting their friends off scot-free?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is working very hard to fight tax evasion and tax avoidance. $1 billion was invested, Mr. Speaker. We have results that are concrete. We've had searches conducted. We have criminal investigations underway. And we even have convictions, Mr. Speaker. We are working on this file, unlike the Conservatives, who spent 10 years not doing anything. They didn't do anything, and it wasn't even a priority for their government.
The Honourable Member for Milton.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to use some numbers so that this government understands the hypocrisy of what they're talking about. As I said, a Liberal bagman stashed $60 million away in a tax-free account in the Cayman Islands. Now let's pretend that this $60 million was put into a passive investment account by a small business person here in Canada. Mr. Speaker, that would be a tax bill of $43 million. Why is the Prime Minister allowing his friends get off on a tax bill of $43 million?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to fighting tax evasion and tax avoidance. The hypocrisy of the members across the way is amazing, Mr. Speaker. The former Minister Jean-Pierre Blackburn admitted in a public interview that
Pierre. Alors.
Order.
Merci. Honorable Minister.
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of National Revenue has the floor. Mr. Speaker, former Minister Jean-Pierre Blackburn admitted it in an interview. Tax evasion was not a priority for the Conservative government. So we will not be taking lessons from a party that works every day to ensure that the wealthiest can keep their privileges. Canadians want to have a fair tax system for all.
Éclairable.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-Lérable. Well, let's talk about privilege. It pays to be a member of the Liberals' inner circle. When the member for Papineau told his friend Stephen Bronfman that he wanted to become the leader of his party, his response was clear. Anything I can do to help. In the same interview, he said that the goal was to bring in a whole bunch of money to help the Liberal leader become the next Prime Minister. It's very revealing, Mr. Speaker. It seems that tax fairness only applies to those who help the Liberal leader become Prime Minister. Why is the Prime Minister going after farmers and job creators while refusing to fight tax evasion among his inner circle? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Tax evasion is a priority for our government, and I would remind the member across the way, the Conservatives, that we voted for the Canada Child Benefit, which is lifting children out of poverty. We lowered taxes for the middle class, Mr. Speaker. We increased the guaranteed income supplement. We abolished the Harper reform that targeted people who were receiving EI. We invested in infrastructure, Mr. Speaker. And these are all things that we did and that the government across the way voted against. We are the government that is working for the middle class. The Honourable Member for Mégantic-Lérable. Well, Stephen Bronfman is gathering money for the Liberals. And again, the Liberal hypocrisy is plain to see. Taxing people with disabilities, why not? Taxing employee discounts, oh, that sounds fair. Targeting farmers and small businesses by calling them tax cheats? Well, they need to pay their fair share. But when it comes to protecting millionaire friends like Stephen Bronfman, the Prime Minister is ready to let anything go. When will the Prime Minister put an end to this tax hypocrisy, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, as Minister of National Revenue, I can tell you that tax evasion and avoidance are global issues that require a global response. The OECD brought together many countries to work together on the development of new international standards for automatic information sharing. We adopted this standard, and since July 1st, 2017, financial institutions in Canada have started taking steps to look at accounts owned by non-residents, and we're declaring this to the National Revenue Agency. We are taking concrete steps.
High tax hypocrisy is not a new sport for these Liberals. No. It's been perfected over the generations. Yes. Then Finance Minister Paul Martin put foreign flags on his ships to avoid the very taxes he was imposing on everybody else. Now, the Paradise Papers expose that his family business has moved its assets into zero-tax Bermuda. And he's advising this Prime Minister as part of the Liberal economic team. Now that he has been exposed once again for avoiding paying his fair share, will the Finance Minister fire Paul Martin from his economic team?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, I repeat, the hypocrisy of the members of the opposition is just amazing, Mr. Speaker. After 10 years of inaction under the former government, the OECD has brought together countries in order to work on the development of a new international standard for the automatic sharing of information. We have fully adopted this standard, Mr. Speaker. We've invested $1 billion. We've hired new auditors. We've undertaken criminal investigations, and there have been charges laid, Mr. Speaker. We are taking action.
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
Who would advise these Liberals to raise taxes on people suffering with diabetes while allowing multimillionaire party fundraisers shelter their money away in tax havens? Who would advise these Liberals to impose higher taxes on farmers while protecting Morneau Chappelle? We know who. The Finance Minister, whose family business has assets in Barbados. The former Finance Minister, who we know now puts his assets in Bermuda. And, of course, the Liberal fundraiser, Mr. Bronfman. Mr. Speaker, why is it when they raise taxes, it only affects everyone but them?
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, this government made a commitment to Canadians to ensure that we were engaging with Canadians And that's exactly why we've taken historic consultations to ensure that the programs and laws that we pass actually benefit them. This is the government that lowered taxes on the wealthiest 1% of Canadians, that increased taxes on the wealthiest 1% of Canadians by lowering taxes on middle-class Canadians. Mr. Speaker, this is a government that's committed to lowering taxes on small businesses to 9% by 2019. This government will continue to ensure that their voices are being heard. This government will continue fighting for middle-class Canadians and those working hard.
Order. I want to remind those members who are consistently heckling that they may be taking a question away from their own side.
The Honourable Member for Laurier-Sainte-Marie. Order. Mr. Speaker, the LGBTQ plus community welcomed the Liberal government's commitment to apologize for injustices that were committed against them in the past. But we want to know that these will be real, meaningful apologies. So, will the Liberal government confirm today that it will be the Prime Minister himself that will give the apology, that the apology will be included in the record of the House of Commons, and that it will include reparations?
Honourable Chief Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, this is an issue that we take very seriously. We respect the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We know that more work needs to be done, and that's exactly why we will continue to engage with Canadians to ensure that we are delivering for them. This government knows that Canadians have a role in this place. We will engage with them. We will make sure we do it right. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Esquimalt Saanich Sooke.
Well, it's clear the government's got a problem knowing who's in charge of this one. What we're asking is that the Liberals make a commitment today to a just apology for the past injustices to the LGBTQ community. That means an apology by the Prime Minister in this House, and one that includes redress measures. Those who were kicked out of the Canadian Forces still have dishonourable discharges on their record. Those who were convicted because of who they love still have criminal records for things that are no longer illegal, and this continues to limit their ability to volunteer, travel, and work. Will the Liberal government commit today to a just apology for my community, to righting past wrongs and not just expressing regret?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister some months ago appointed the Honourable Member for Edmonton Centre to consult broadly across the country with the community to make sure that all elements of this issue were properly heard and known and taken into account, so that the apology, when given, can be thorough and complete, and the other appropriate actions around that apology can reinforce the basic message of rights and freedoms in this country.
Honourable Member for Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and his Finance Minister are on the hunt for Canadians to tax. If you're a small business, they'll tax you. If you're suffering from diabetes, they'll tax you. If you're dealing with autism or mental health issues, they will tax you. But if you're a billionaire, close friend of the Prime Minister, you can avoid paying taxes with impunity. When will the Prime Minister stop treating hard-working Canadians like tax cheats and go after his own crew?
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, let's try this again. This government is a government that lowered taxes on middle-class Canadians by increasing taxes on the wealthiest 1% of Canadians. This government is a government that recognizes that small businesses are the backbone of the Canadian economy and that they are community builders. We want to see them succeed, and that's exactly why we have committed to lowering the small business tax rate to 9% by 2019. And I really look forward to members opposite recognizing that small businesses are the backbone of the economy and they should be paying a lower tax rate. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Barrie, Springwater, Oro-Medonte.
Mr. Speaker, instead of going after his own friend, the Prime Minister has decided to target Canadians with autism, mental health disabilities, and diabetics. Stephen Bronfman, the Prime Minister's close friend and chief Liberal bagman, is the poster boy for tax avoidance schemes. When will the Prime Minister stop targeting Canada's most vulnerable citizens and stop making excuses for tax avoiders like Mr. Bronfman?
Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to ensure that all Canadians get the benefits that they are entitled to. we're going to move forward with a bill concerning persons with disabilities that will eliminate barriers to accessibility for all Canadians living with disabilities. We've facilitated access to the disability tax credit. We've simplified the forms, and in Budget 2017, we allowed nurse practitioners to fill out those patient requests. We've continued to work with our partners. The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, while the Prime Minister is asking Canadians to pay ever more taxes for his reckless spending, members of the Liberal Party's inner circle are placing money in tax havens and getting around Canadian tax requirements that apply to middle-class families. Mr. Speaker, why are the Liberals targeting people with disabilities, diabetes, mental health issues, and autism, and treating them like tax cheats instead of going after their friends who are hiding money in tax havens? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is committed to ensuring that all Canadians receive the tax credits they're entitled to. The eligibility for this tax credit has not changed, Mr. Speaker. It's important to recognize that far too many Canadians live with disabilities and problems and need help. We want to ensure that they're able to keep more of their hard-earned money by maintaining the working income tax benefit, and we will continue to deliver the goods just as we promised during the election campaign.
Member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Mr. Speaker, the Revenue Minister keeps telling us she's so proud that our tax collectors are targeting Canadians. Her tax collectors are systematically raising taxes on type 1 diabetics, Canadians with mental health issues, and autism. Her tax collectors are so busy targeting the most vulnerable, they seem to have forgotten about the Prime Minister's wealthy friends. When will the Minister finally tell her tax collectors to lay off sick and vulnerable Canadians and focus on real tax cheats?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, I worked for 25 years as a social worker, and I always worked to help protect the most vulnerable in our society. Our government has committed to ensuring that people receive the tax credits they are entitled to. We are moving forward with a national act, Mr. Speaker, for persons with disabilities that will eliminate barriers and focus on accessibility. We have simplified the forms. We have allowed for the hiring of nurse practitioners who can help people fill out their forms. We promised this during the election campaign, and we are continuing to do this to help the most vulnerable members of our society, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, dairy farmers are in Ottawa today, and many of them are concerned. And they have a right to be concerned, because even though the Liberals campaigned on being inclusive and different and transparent, they continue to negotiate the TPP in the dark, just like the Conservatives. Dairy farmers and Canadians believe that this deal was dead. But we've learned that agreement could be reached this week. This agreement will contain a breach in supply management, and the new NAFTA could do exactly the same thing. Mr. Speaker, how much market access will this government allow in our supply-managed sectors?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for International Trade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada is a strong supporter of progressive trade, and Asia-Pacific is a priority market for our government. We're actively engaged with the remaining TPP countries, and the Minister is in Vietnam right now working hard to deliver real change and better results for Canadians and the middle class. We're discussing options for a possible agreement, and we're also discussing ways to improve the terms of trade for Canadian businesses. This work is critical. We're taking our time. We're pressing for a better deal. We feel we owe this to Canadians to diversify markets abroad and create jobs for people here at home.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, last week we learned that the U.S. Department of Commerce announced its final determination with regard to the duties that will be levied on Canadian softwood lumber. In Saguenay-Lac-Saint-Jean, 11,000 jobs will be threatened by export duties that can go up, that will be up to 21%. Now, we knew that this decision was imminent, but on the Liberal side, it's just yet another failure in a long list. And they haven't made any gains or really defended the softwood lumber industry. When will they take the situation in hand to save our jobs?
The Honourable Parliamentary
Secretary. The punitive duties imposed by the U.S. Department of Commerce are unjust and very troubling. Our forest industry has never been found guilty in any previous conflicts. We will take this decision to court, and we will win, as we have done every time. We want a good agreement for Canada, not just any agreement, Mr. Speaker.
Port Kells.
Mr. Speaker, Canada has the longest coastline in the world, and the health and protection of our coasts are critical to our environment, our economy, and to all Canadians. At our Standing Committee on Fisheries and Oceans, we hear many different views on how to prosper, but everyone agrees that we have to protect our waters and our shorelines. It was a year ago today that the Prime Minister introduced the Oceans Protection Plan. So can the Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard update us on our progress? Good question.
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries, Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard.
That was an excellent question from the member from Fleetwood, Port Kells. One of the 4 pillars of our Ocean Protection Plan is strengthening partnerships with Indigenous communities, including building local emergency response capacity. Just last week, the first session under the Indigenous Community Response Training Project wrapped up in Bamfield, British Columbia. 9 members from 7 Northern First Nations graduated from the Coastal Nation Search and Rescue course, enhancing this important capacity for the Canadian Coast Guard. Mr. Speaker, as you know, we'll do what it takes to protect Canada's oceans.
Hear, hear.
Sometimes ministers mention the hard work of members on the file, but anyway, I don't know. The Honourable members always enjoy that, you know. The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, we know the excuse writers in the Prime Minister's office are working overtime as new Liberal ethics and conflict issues accumulate. But Canadians are still waiting for a few meaningful answers from the Finance Minister. He was found guilty and fined by the Ethics Commissioner for hiding his French corporation for 2 years. He has effectively admitted guilt for hiding his shares in Morneau Shepell for 2 years. Now the minister still owns other numbered companies, Mr. Speaker. What new conflicts might we find if the contents were revealed to Canadians?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
I'm pleased to report to this House that I have and will continue to disclose all of my assets to the Ethics Commissioner. What that does is that allows us to get on the work that we want to do for Canadians. And I'm also pleased to report this to this House that that work is having a real impact. We've now passed 500,000 new jobs in this country since we were elected, the lowest unemployment rate in a decade. Canadians are more confident than they've been in years, and it's showing up in the growth rate that we're seeing across our country. Mr. Speaker, our plan is working, and we're going to continue the hard work on behalf of Canadians.
Deputy de Beauport, Côte de Beaupré.
Honourable Member for Beauport, Côte de Beaupré, Île-de-Orléans, Charlevoix. To be or not to be, that is the question. In this tragicomic theatre performance entitled The New Liberal Scandal, we're wondering who has the starring role, the Minister of Finance or the Prime Minister? We're not getting any answers to simple questions, and we haven't been for weeks. What exactly are they hiding, and why won't they answer? Are they writing a new chapter in this story called Gummery 2? Or will they finally answer this very simple question? What is the Minister of Finance hiding with his numbered companies? Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, our government is firmly committed to fighting tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance, and in our first 2 budgets, we invested close to $1 billion, Mr. Speaker, which allowed us to hire 100 auditors, and that have been delivering historic results, Mr. Speaker. 627 criminal investigations, 268 search warrants, and 78 convictions, Mr. Speaker. The work has just begun, and we're going to continue to work on it up until we've gotten more results.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians want to know what this finance minister has been hiding from them over the past 2 years. They know he hid his stocks in Morneau Shepell. They know he hid his ownership in a French corporation, an act for which he was found guilty by the Ethics Commissioner. And over the last 2 years, he has not disclosed what he's owned in his various numbered companies. Simple question. He may have disclosed yesterday, but the previous 2 years, he has not disclosed to Canadians what's in his numbered company. What's he hiding?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, the member opposite is incorrect. I have disclosed what's in all of my companies to the Ethics Commissioner, and from day one I've disclosed 100% of my assets to the Ethics Commissioner. That is what allows us to do the work that we're doing on behalf of Canadians. The work that we started 2 years ago when we found ourselves with an economy that was not growing fast enough. We decided that we had a choice, and the choice was to create jobs for Canadians. Mr. Speaker, it's working. Again, more than 500,000 new jobs over the last 2 years, a situation where our economy is growing faster than it's grown in a decade. This is helping Canadian families to succeed.
Honourable Opposition, order. Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Very typical of this finance minister, playing games with words and semantics, but the spirit of disclosing his assets, by which he was found guilty by the Ethics Commissioner, he is absolutely guilty of, and he doesn't have the decency to admit it to Canadians. This is why they don't trust him. Very simple question. If he had nothing to hide over the last 2 years when he was regulating industries that he may have owned shares in, why doesn't he tell Canadians what he owned in the last 2 years in his number of companies? And no semantics.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, on this side of the House, we don't play games and we don't use semantics. What we do is we disclose what we need to disclose in order to make sure we get on with the work. So by disclosing all of my assets to the Ethics Commissioner.
Order. Earlier, I asked members to try not to be provoked by things because people on both sides will sometimes say things that some might find provocative, but the challenge for all of us is to be like most of members in this House, of all parties, who are able to sit through question period and hear things that they might consider provocative without reacting. The Honourable Minister of Finance has the floor. Order.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to finish off, what we're doing on this side of the House is we are very focused on ensuring that Canadians are successful. And the good news is it's absolutely working. Canadians have a higher level of confidence because they actually have more money. The Canada Child Benefit, the tax reductions that we put in place have allowed people to put money back into our economy, which is helping all of us to succeed. It's a good news story for Canadians, Mr. Speaker.
We take to Sherbrooke.
The Honourable Member for Sherbrooke. Mr. Speaker, I really don't know what the Minister of National Revenue doesn't understand, but while she's dragging her feet, the Liberal cronies continue to benefit from the system that they're keeping in place, just like the Liberal bagman who is apparently sheltered millions of dollars from taxes in the Cayman Islands, and that is a notorious tax haven. Canada even signed a tax information agreement with it, and so the CRA should have been aware of the scams being conducted by the Liberal cronies. So, Mr. Speaker, why do we have these tax agreements with tax havens unless it is to allow the Liberal clique to escape their tax obligations? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, unlike my colleague across the way, we at least have results to announce. Over the past 2 years, we invested close to $1 billion, Mr. Speaker, and our plan is working. We identify 4 jurisdictions a year. We have hired over 100 tax auditors. 627 cases have been transferred to criminal investigations, 268 search warrants, and 78 convictions, Mr. Speaker. That's just the beginning. We're continuing our work as we promised Canadians during the election campaign, and we're going to do that very same work throughout our mandate.
Air Force, Skeena Bulkley Valley.
Speaker, we all wondered how the Liberals were going to try to change the channel from the Morneau-Chappelle fiasco. Who knew that they would be using a massive tax haven scandal to get our minds off their massive ethics scandal? But to make matters worse, Liberals have been hiding much of how much money is lost to these tax havens. For years, they fought against the release of the so-called tax gap in Canada. Just like Bill C-58, their no access to information bill, the Liberals deny basic information that is owed to Canadians. So a very simple question. Will this government finally tell Canadians how much money their millionaire and billionaire friends actually owe this country?
The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, we promised Canadians that we would review the tax gap, and that's what we're doing. Unlike the previous government, which systematically opposed tackling the tax gap, we have adopted a fact-based approach. To date, the CRA has shown its commitment to estimating or evaluating the tax gap, and 3 studies have been done since June 2016. We are pursuing our efforts to address the tax gap. That's what Canadians expect from us. And in 2018, we'll be publishing a report on the international aspect of the tax gap.
Mr. Speaker, the latest Liberal budget that joins Canada to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank will send up to $500 million overseas for infrastructure. Yet the Liberals aren't delivering on infrastructure here at home. Just several weeks ago, Toronto said that Ottawa is making unreasonable demands and could pull $121 million in TTC funding from the federal government. Mr. Speaker, why are the Liberals so eager to send infrastructure money overseas while neglecting to spend on desperately needed roads and transit right here at home?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities.
Mr. Speaker, we're proud to have approved, and as the member well knows, more than 4,000 projects since taking office, with a combined investment of more than $35 billion. Federal investments are enabling these projects to move forward. And as the honourable member knows, the federal contributions are paid when the expense claims are submitted by our partners. We'll continue to work with our partners to move their priorities forward and provide the flexibility necessary to meet those requirements. We are in ongoing discussions with the province, and we trust their judgment in telling us what the priorities are. Thank you.
The honourable member for Portneuf, Jacques Cartier. Mr. Speaker, on speaking of flexibility, let's talk to the municipalities. After receiving generous contributions from Asian promoters, the Liberal Party is promising $480 million to the Asian Bank. It's really disappointing to see that this government is not delivering on infrastructure here at home in Canada. They promise municipalities oodles of money, but then they attach all sorts of useless conditions, and projects then have to be cancelled. Instead of swanning around Asia and working against Canadian taxpayers and municipalities, will this Prime Minister be a real partner of our municipalities, Mr. Speaker? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, as the member knows, we are proud of having approved 4,000 projects since we came to power, with combined investments of over $35 billion. Investments from the federal government will advance these projects. As the honourable member knows full well, the expense claims have to be submitted first, and we will continue to work with our partners in order to further their priorities and offer them the flexibility they need. And in Quebec, I'm very proud to announce that several hundreds of projects are being unfolded.
For Richmond Centre.
Mr. Speaker, during the first quarter of this year, opioids killed over 900 Canadians. This government needs to help. The Liberals only gave $10 million to fight the opioid crisis, but it's no problem giving $500 million to the Asian Infrastructure Bank. Mr. Speaker, why is this government sending $500 million to foreign billionaires when we have Canadians dying in our streets by the hundreds? Canada is our home.
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased that the member opposite has given us an opportunity to talk about some of the things our government is doing to address the opioid crisis. And for example, our government has provided $10 million in urgent support to our provincial partners in British Columbia, $6 million to the province of Alberta to assist in their response, and that's in addition to $22.7 million ongoing to the $100 million commitment in Budget 17 to support national measures associated with the Canadian Drugs and Substances Strategy and to respond to this terrible health crisis.
Honourable member for Châteauguay-Lacolle. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The citizens who live on the shores of Lake St. Louis are concerned about the Catherine Spirit. The former government did nothing about this abandoned vessel, which has been in Beauharnois for some years now, and it is our government that began the process of dismantling it. 1 year ago today, the Prime Minister announced our Oceans Protection Plan. Can the Minister tell us how this plan will affect any other abandoned vessels like the Catherine Spirit? The Honourable Minister of Transport. I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for her question and her diligent work. Our government is particularly proud of what we have done for abandoned vessels across the country, and thanks to the Oceans Protection Plan. And we are legislating the responsibility of owners for their vessels. We're funding the removal of small craft that are at high risk, and we're giving more flexibility to the government to act proactively regarding high-risk vessels. Mr. Speaker, we take this work very seriously. Thank you.
For Brantford Brant.
Despite promising not to do so in the last election, these Liberals took veterans back to court. Now we've learned that veterans are being forced to wait longer and longer to get the benefits they've earned. Today, the Prime Minister is hurrying off to Asia to deliver on his priority, infrastructure handouts to the world's wealthy. Can the Minister of Veterans Affairs tell us, why are veterans being shortchanged while the Prime Minister sends $500 million to wealthy bankers in Asia?
No. Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, delivering timely benefit decisions is in an area where we can and we must do better. In 2015-2016, we saw a 25% increase in the number of disability claims, and that is a good thing because that means more veterans are coming forward for the help that they need. To address this increase, we are simplifying the benefits process, hiring more staff, and giving the benefit of the doubt to the veteran. When it comes to veteran care, we can always strive for excellence, and we will. Merci.
Honourable Member for North Island Powell River.
Mr. Speaker, over 235,000 people are without a home in our country. In Canada, housing should be a right. Liberals like to talk about the right to housing but are unwilling to enshrine it in law. Maybe this explains why not a single Liberal spoke on my bill C-325 during its second hour of debate. Mr. Speaker, are the Liberals keeping silent because they are just too ashamed to speak against the human right to housing?
The Honourable Minister of Social Development.
Take this opportunity to say how important the right to housing decently in Canada is for everyone, and in particular for the more vulnerable Canadians. We know how important housing is for life in community and for life also in a proper home, to participate in the life of everyone else around ourselves. I have good news to announce, Mr. Speaker. In a very short time, I invite our colleague to listen very carefully.
The Honourable Member for Kelowna Lake Country.
Mr. Speaker, Canada's network of protected areas help to mitigate the impacts of climate change. They protect and restore healthy, resilient ecosystems and assist in the recovery of species at risk. Canada is committed to conserve at least 17% of our country's land and fresh water by 2020 in collaboration with the provinces, territories, Indigenous peoples, and other key partners. Can the government please update this House on the recent progress towards this target?
Minister of Environment.
Canadians love our parks, national parks and national heritage places, and we saw that clearly this year with record attendance at our parks and historic places with free entry for Canada 150. On Friday, October 27th, I was extremely pleased to be joined by the member of Kelowna Lake Country as Canada and British Columbia and representatives of the southern communities of the Syilx Okanagan Nation announced a renewed commitment to move forward together to establish a new national park reserve in the South Okanagan. After many years, we're pleased to be moving forward to protect this iconic place, and I want to thank the member for his help.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
Mr. Speaker, during the last election, the Liberals made specific commitments to support justice and reconciliation in Sri Lanka, following terrible crimes committed at the end of the Civil War and in light of ongoing human rights concerns for the Tamil community today. Instead of acting, the Liberals cancelled the Office of Religious Freedom, undercutting existing initiatives to promote pluralism and human rights, and their new office has been completely absent on this. So why has the government failed to take any concrete action to implement their commitments with respect to human rights in Sri Lanka?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable colleague for the question. Human rights is a foundational part of Canada's international work, and I'll correct the record because he knows full well that this government tripled funding to the new Office of Human Rights, Freedoms and Inclusion. When it comes to human rights around the world, this government is taking a leadership role. We're doing this in all of our engagements, and I hope that the Conservative opposition will join us in helping promote human rights and defend human rights as we are doing around the world.
The Honourable Member for Peel Boucher of Les Patriotes Verchères. Mr. Speaker, the Liberals are being hypocritical when they claim to be tackling tax havens. In the past 30 years, no country in the world has facilitated tax evasion more than Canada. The tax loopholes that they're pretending to fight today, well, it's actually Ottawa who created them. Tax avoidance is actually allowed by law, and when the Bloc Québécois identified them, well, what happened? Well, all the Liberals voted against our bill. Why is the government hiding when we're calling on it to amend the law that would protect these nice little Liberals? The Honourable Minister. Our government is firmly committed to fighting tax avoidance and tax evasion. We've invested some $1 billion over the past 2 years, Mr. Speaker. We have targeted 4 jurisdictions a year. We have hired 100 tax auditors, and our plan is working, Mr. Speaker, because we have 627 cases transferred to criminal investigations, 268 search warrants, and 78 convictions. No one has done more than this government over the past few years, unlike the Bloc Québécois, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Joliette. We're very tired of hearing the same old record, because the taxes that the rich people don't pay when they use tax havens, well, everyone else has to pay them. The money that Stephen Bronfman hid in the Cayman Islands don't go for hospitals and schools. It stays in his pocket with the Liberal government's blessing. Those rich people drive their limousines on the roads that we're paying for. When is the government going to start disparaging taxpayers and end the use of tax havens? The Honourable Minister of National Revenue. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind my colleague across the way that tax evasion and aggressive tax avoidance is a priority for the CRA. I can give him the following information because in addition to the penalties of $44 million that were levied on tax advisors last year, for the last year alone, the CRA's actions have led to 37 convictions, a number of years of imprisonment, and $2 billion in fines imposed by the courts. We're continuing to do our work right up until the end, Mr. Speaker.
I would